Okay, so apparently I deleted the first files for the chapter 20 recordings. Whoops. So I'm going to have to redo this. I'm hoping that you'll be able to see me, and I'm probably going to use one of my recordings for that I did for lab for this because it'll basically be the same part of the lecture when we talk about the pathway of blood through the heart. So here we go. Okay, so the cardiovascular system, the heart. So outline of the chapter, same old, same old. So let's talk about the heart for a second. The heart is actually two separate pumps. You've got one pump that brings in deoxygenated blood from the body and then sends it to the lungs so that we get air. And then you've got another pump that brings that oxygenated blood in from the lungs and sends it out to the body. So what's a fancy way of saying lungs? Pulmonary. So you've got pulmonary circulation that is actually going to the lungs, and you've got systemic circulation, which is going to the body. So again, pulmonary, fancy way of saying lungs. Systemic, pretty much the rest of your systems in your body. So the functions of the heart, 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 the functions. So first thing, it generates our blood pressure. The contractions of the heart generate blood pressure, which is responsible for the blood movement through the vessels. Something you have to understand, how hard your blood is pushing up against the sides of those vessels is determined by how hard your heart squeezes that blood out. The harder it squeezes, the harder that blood is pushing on the side of the vessel. So when we talk about your blood pressure, I don't know what that was. If we're talking about your blood pressure and the pressure that's created, that squeeze by the heart is actually what's creating the pressure. It would be like turning on a spigot next to your house. The higher that spigot is, the harder that water pushes up against the sides of the hose. The harder the heart contracts, the harder that blood pushes against the sides of the hoses of your arteries. Okay, routing the blood. The heart is the interchange between pulmonary and systemic circulation, thus ensuring better oxygenation of blood going to the tissues. You have to remember that your heart has valves that basically are the guarantee that it goes in one direction but never comes back, because it's like a trap door. If it opens this way, once it closes, you can't come back that other way. So you've got this kind of interchange between the pulmonary and the systemic, the pulmonary and the systemic. And the heart is basically right dead center in the middle of that, directing that flow based off of what side of the heart you come in on and what valves are opening and closing. All right. Ensuring one-way blood flow. Again, the valves of the heart are one way. They only work in one direction. They don't work in many directions. It's literally, you got one shot and you're done. So basically what that does is that ensures there's no backflow. There can't be any backflow because valves work in one direction, but when you try and push backwards, they immediately seal shut. Regulating your blood supply. As the metabolic needs of the tissues change, the heart can change rate and force of contraction to aid tissues. This is pretty simple. When you exercise, does your heart speed up? Why? Well, honestly, it's because your muscles are using more oxygen, they're making more waste, they need more nutrients, so the blood needs to travel faster to drop things off and pick things up. How do I do that? I get the heart to go on ahead and pump faster. As my body's needs change, my heart changes what it's doing. If I'm exercising, even a little bit, yeah, my heart's going to speed up. But if I'm sleeping, there's no reason for my heart to be going. If it's doing that, then there's something wrong in that case. And I need to go see a cardiologist, because your heart shouldn't be doing that if you're just sitting around or laying down and going to sleep. But when you are sleeping, your heart kind of does the opposite of what it does when we're moving and exercising. It slows down, it brings the pressure down, because I don't need that. The organs of my body aren't in need of extra blood and in need of extra nutrients and in need of getting rid of wastes. So it changes as our activity level changes. 1 second. I moved my lamp to see if it would work better, light me up just a little bit more. I don't think it worked. Okay, so the size, shape, and location of the heart. The size of a closed fist shaped like a blunt cone lies obliquely within the mediastinum, with its base directed back and superior and the apex coming forward inferiorly to the left. First time I read that, I went, what? Okay, so your heart's about the size of your fist, all right? And if you look at the heart here, you'll notice that this kind of comes to a point, and up here, this is kind of blunt, almost like a triangle, okay? So let's say this is the pointy end where my pinky is, all right? Your heart sits like this. So it kind of comes forward and down. This is actually kind of coming down toward the left. And then that flat top is actually going back toward this shoulder. So your heart lies at an angle inside of here. It's one of the reasons why your left lung is actually smaller than your right. The fact that it's leaning this way means that you've got to kind of cut a chunk out of this lung to make room for it to sit there. Okay, so don't let it lies obliquely within the media. It lies at an angle inside of the chest, with its flat end up here going toward your right shoulder and the pointy end down here going toward your left hip. Okay, yeah. So the anatomy of the heart, the pericardium, the heart wall, the external anatomy of the coronary circulation, and heart chambers and valves. So your heart pumps. Every single second of every single day, your heart pumps and it rubs. So let me ask you something. If I were to do this for 5 hours with my hands, what's going to happen to the surface of my hands? Probably going to rub the surface of my hand draw, right? So how do I prevent that? What if I put a pair of gloves on, shove my hands in Vaseline with the gloves on, and then do this for 5 hours? Well, that rubbing friction that I'm causing is actually going to be on the gloves. And because I've got Vaseline on my hands, I have lubricant. Your heart pumps 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, from before you are born until the day you die. It doesn't take a break. It doesn't take a breather. So you have to have kind of protection around your heart. So there is a sac surrounding the heart. Sorry. There's a sac surrounding the heart. It's made of 2 layers that can also be called the pericardial sac. Peri means around, and then what's a cardio? Heart. So you've got this sac that sits around your heart. Okay? It can change in size to accommodate more fluid or change in heart size. It'll actually expand kind of like an elastic waistband on pants if it needs to, because your heart gets bigger because volume gets bigger, or even your heart just itself starts to enlarge. It'll actually enlarge with it, okay? So around the outside, we have this fibrous pericardium. Basically, the fibrous pericardium is like a suspension bridge. It holds your heart up in place in your chest so that it doesn't just go poof. We want it to stay where it is. So this helps it to do that. The serous pericardium is internal to that and actually has two layers, okay? So if you look at the picture, there's a blue layer right underneath this kind of gray-white layer. That's the parietal pericardium. It literally lies right underneath the fibrous pericardium. It's these layers, the parietal and the visceral, that help to reduce the friction on the heart while it's beating, okay? In between the surface of the heart, where we have the visceral pericardium, remember, you hear the word visceral. Visceral means internal. They talk about visceral organs. Those are all your internal organs. So the visceral pericardium is like shrink wrap on top of the heart. The parietal is actually covering the cavity that heart is sitting in. And in between, there is space called the pericardial cavity. Now, the pericardial cavity is filled with pericardial fluid. Remember the Vaseline I talked about putting my hands in so that it was nice and lubricated? This actually helps to lubricate between my pericardial membrane and my visceral membrane. So as your heart is pumping, there's lubricant in between those two layers. But again, it's not my actual physical heart that's rubbing, it's the membranes that are doing that. So I've got the visceral pericardium on top of the heart, the parietal covering that space that your heart is sitting in, and then the cavity in between, which you can see that big white space that is filled with pericardial fluid, which is that lubricant that I've been talking about. Now, if I were to take a bore out of the heart and just take a chunk and put it down, this is what you would see, okay? You've got this outer layer here. Now, this outer layer is actually going to be the epicardium, but technically it's still the visceral pericardium. Two names for the same thing. It would be like calling me Ronica or calling me Miss Williams. Doesn't matter which one it is, still me, right? So this outer layer, when we're kind of talking about the meat of your heart, is going to be called the epicardium. Epi means above, right? Visceral pericardium is more when we're talking about the membranes. Now, myocardium, that's this big pink layer right here. Myo means muscle. Cardio means heart. What are the muscle tissues that we have? Oh, wait. Got cardiac muscle, right? Cardiac muscle is the majority of what makes up your heart because this is the one tissue that we have that moves. So that beating and squeezing of your heart is because of the myocardium or the heart muscle, okay? This is responsible for the contraction of your heart because it is muscle tissue. Now, this inner layer right here, the endocardium, okay? It is the innermost layer and it protects from friction created by flowing blood, simple squamous epithelium over connective tissue. The heart valves, those trap doors that I was talking about, are actually going to be the the endocardium modified. So something you have to understand, blood is not water. Blood is nothing like water. It has salts in it. It has sugars in it. It has cells in it. It has proteins in it. And ultimately, if it's being poured on something or rushed through something, it can become rather abrasive. I mean, imagine taking salt water and letting it drip on your arm for hours and hours and hours, or basically sandblasting something with salt water. It's not a good sensation. So the inner chambers of your heart actually do have to have a protective layer around them so that it doesn't irritate or get irritated by the blood that's flowing through them. That's why it is a protective layer. It protects from the friction created by the flowing blood. Now, we've got 4 chambers to our heart. Okay, now something to keep in mind with the heart and pretty much every other organ that you have, if we're talking about right and left. This is as if it is sitting in your chest. So if you're looking at a patient, Your right is their left. Okay? So you have to keep that in mind. Turn the heart around, put it in your chest. So you've got two top chambers. You've got the right atrium and the left atrium. Now for you, the right atrium and the left atrium. Then you've got two bottom chambers. Those are the ventricles. And again, right ventricle, left ventricle. In your chest, right ventricle, left ventricle. The atria, the top, they're actually relatively small. They're not actually that big. They're mainly smooth. They've got some raised areas that we call pectinate muscles. Okay? Pectinate muscles are kind of ridges, but they're semi-smooth ridges that exist inside of the atria. They're separated by smooth parts. By a ridge called the cristae terminalis. Okay? So you've got kind of this ridgy looking tissue, but you also have kind of this smooth ridge in between those ridges. Now, the ventricles, they have these huge, like chunks of muscle that look like raised, almost branches. If you look at the picture, see these raised looking branches here? These are called the trabeculae carnae, or as I like to say, the carne. Okay, for those of you that are way too young to remember this, years ago, Taco Bell had a commercial and it had two lions. They were talking about some burrito or something, and one of them was like, "Ooh, carne," and the other one's like, "No. You have to say it, carne, carne, carne." Anyway, I thought it was funny. You probably don't, but that's okay because I'm a science nerd, so there you go. But the trabeculae carnae only exist in the ventricles. And in the ventricles, you've got those big raised ridges that, I mean, they almost look like posts. Okay? So looking at the heart from the front. So you're looking at the anterior view, as if you're looking at somebody's heart this direction. Okay? From the anterior view, see these little things here and that little piece of a thing here? These are the atria. From there down, all the way to the apex or the point at the end of the heart, that's the ventricles. The ventricles make up the majority of the heart. Why? Because the ventricles are the power pumps that actually have to push that blood out of the heart to another location. All the atria are doing is loading and dumping into the bottom chamber, which is the ventricle, and then the ventricle shoots it either to the lungs or it shoots it to the rest of the body. Top of the head, bottom of the toes, you gotta have a lot of power to do that. So the majority of the muscle of your heart is going to be in the ventricles. So again, we've got the right atrium, we've got the left atrium, which is actually behind these quite a bit, but it's there. We've got, where am I going? The right ventricle and the left ventricle, okay? Again, right and left as if it's in your chest when it's sitting in a patient. Now, something else. The atria are the chambers, they're the holes. Externally, though, they've got these kind of folds that when volume increases, they can expand. But when they're not expanded, they're just kind of folded in like this, and they end up kind of looking like a dog ear. You know how dog ears fold over? So when you're looking at the outside of the heart and you see those kind of extra folds on the outside of the atria, you actually call them the auricles. Auricle, if you remember back from chapter 15, means ear. So you've got the left auricle and you've got the right auricle, which are just extra space so that if volume increases, there's room for that atria to actually expand without tearing. Okay, I'm going to stop there and I'll continue in a minute.